Well, good evening, and welcome to our Monday night study of 1 Corinthians. And glad to have you with us. And we are in session 6 and focusing on chapter 7. And as you know, we sometimes, with our tongue in our cheek, like to call this letter 1 Californians, because there's a very close concept between what they knew as Corinth and what we know as Hollywood, Las Vegas, and New York all wrapped up into one. So I'm just calling it Californians, but to try to give it a contemporary flavor. But this passage that we're going to deal with is going to be on marriage, and should never be taken alone, by the way. We should realize the problems in Corinth are not the same as was in Berea, Philippi, or Ephesus. And so to get Paul's full view of marriage, you got to look at his other letters, not just this one. Because Corinth was a church of contradictions. The diverse response to the widespread immorality included two different things: licentiousness on the one hand, and a legalistic asceticism on the other. Sex itself is never sin. It is the abuse of this God-given function that makes it immoral. And Titus 1:15 is one of your references on that. Paul uses language that's found nowhere else in the New Testament. He'll say by permission and so forth, and we'll watch that closely. It's still authoritative in view of their circumstances. But there's no law that is so inclusive as to apply in every situation. So let's keep that in mind. So we'll notice this phrase here, now concerning. He's referring to a letter. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. So he's making a reference here to terms that were in the letter that they sent to him. And so he's going to respond to a list of questions in their earlier letter. And he sent a previous letter, and they replied with questions delivered by Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. And that's all been, we referred to that back in chapter 5. We'll keep moving here. And now concerning, that's a phrase we're going to see him use all through this letter, a key phrase. And on marriage in chapter 7, we're going to talk about that quite a bit tonight. Celibacy, he'll touch on. Now concerning meat offered to idols, and then the spiritual gifts, the collection for Jerusalem Christians in chapter 16, Apollos in chapter 16. So the resurrection is also a very key thing, but it doesn't happen to have that phrase, now concerning. All these other topics have that phrase. But we must remember as we go through this, the pressures that they were under. There was not only widespread immorality, comparable to our own in our culture, but for them, becoming a Christian was putting one's life in danger. So let's take verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And so this refers to the quote from the previous letter. Paul could not have advocated celibacy for everyone, because if he did, he would be contradicting God's utterance in Genesis chapter 2. It's not good for a man to be alone. And so God's covenant blessings go from generation to generation, and they involve the growth of the church. So he's going to emphasize a high view of marriage in Ephesians chapter 5. So let's not lose sight of that as we go forward in this particular letter with these particular comments. Now, a group of believers in Corinth had set themselves against the widespread immorality in the city by advocating celibacy. And to certain terms there for man, husband, and woman are indefinite terms implying non-marital intercourse. And Paul points out that apostates forbid people to marry. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. And they don't do that in Hollywood, do they? They spread it around a little bit. But anyway, it must be kept in mind that the conditions in Corinth were terrible, almost as bad as ours. You know, we tend to look at them and say, wow, but ours is probably as bad, if not worse. Polygamy was the common practice in their world. And Paul effectively rules out polygamy as well as homosexual combinations. We don't have to dwell on that. It goes on, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not the power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise the husband hath not the power of his own body, but the wife. The elegant paradox. Equality and mutuality is what he's talking about here. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with a consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. And so the word defraud here, by the way, could be rendered deprive. It's a little in our language. Marriage is a protective shield that should be employed effectively against Satan's subtleties, is the suggestion. And that'll also come up in the Ephesians letter in chapter 5. Let's remember that God established the home before he established the church. The home itself is a basic institution of God. We need to never lose sight of that. Now the question that comes up with all these discussions, was Paul married? And there's a diversity of opinion among good scholars about that. The early church tradition was that he was not married. Tertullian, Jerome, and Origen Origen's doubtful about it. Methodius, as well as Clement Alex and Ignatius, believed he was a widower. That was their belief. I happen to believe that Paul was either a widower or possibly that his wife left him after his conversion. But that's a speculation that I've run across. We don't know. And Paul claimed to have failed in none of the duties which Jewish law and tradition laid down. He makes that statement. Well, if that's the case, Orthodox belief laid down the obligation of marriage. That implies that he was married. And there's plenty of references on that if you want to chase those things down. If a man did not marry and have children, he was said to have slain his posterity and to have lessened the image of God in the world. That's the attitude within the Jewish community. And Paul said he never failed in any of his duties. To be fruitful and multiply was viewed as a positive commandment of God, both in Genesis, but also Proverbs 2 and Proverbs 5. So, by the way, it was also the first of the 613 Talmudic precepts. Now, we're not into the 613 rules. That's the Talmud. But still, in that world, being married was considered appropriate. So we suggest he must have been a member. Oh, we know that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. For he says that he gave his vote against the Christians in Acts 26. Well, if that's the case, if he gave his vote in the Sanhedrin, then he had to be married. That was a requirement. Okay? And it was required that members of the Sanhedrin be married, as it was held like this. It was held that married men were more merciful. I'll leave you with that one. And his enablement to be alone was a result of a spiritual gift. So whatever it was, whether she left him at conversion is one speculation. We don't have any evidence of that. Or whether she just passed away, he was a widower, we don't know. He clearly did not have a wife with him on his travels and so forth. But he goes on here and says, I speak this by permission, not of commandment, referring to the temporary abstinence that has the consent of both spouses is what he's alluding to there. And it's a matter of individual responsibility. This is Romans 14. But Paul continues, I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. And we should always remember that, by the way. It's not the same for everybody. These are Paul's own words on a very sensitive issue. Marriage is good, but not every person should be married, he suggests. I say therefore to be unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And what he's talking about there is to burn with sexual desire. He's not talking about hellfire, by the way. Many people read that and jump to a different conclusion. The context is the burn of desire. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. Wow, that's quite a commandment. And he's underscoring that. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, he emphasizes. Let not the wife depart from her husband. And that's the Lord's command in Genesis chapter 1:27, 2:24, and emphasized in Mark 8. And so God hates divorce. And he talks about that in Malachi 2. Matthew wrote for a Jewish audience in which the husband could dismiss his wife for any reason. Mark wrote in a Roman context in which the woman could take the initiative, incidentally. Subtleties between the two that you need to have in mind as you go. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. Let not the husband put away his wife. And by the way, reconciliation is never used of an innocent party. We are reconciled to God, never he to us. Paul teaches what the Scriptures have to say, unadulterated by the culture of his day. He doesn't make compromises because of culture. He teaches what the Scriptures have to say all the way through here. But I want to pause here. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of broken families. Because what we're touching here on, of course, is the whole area of broken families. Many of the statistics I took from a famous article in Atlantic Monthly some years ago. But we know that scientific evidence demonstrates that children in disrupted families do worse than those in intact families. There's plenty of statistics on that. They are 6 times more likely to be poor. 22% of one-parent families will experience poverty during childhood for 7 years or more versus 2% of children in the 2-parent families. So that's 10-to-1 difference. Teen suicide rate has tripled. Juvenile crime has increased and has become more violent. School performances continue to decline. These are just summaries of some statistics. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, children of single-parent families are 3 times as likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. They are more likely to drop out of high school, get pregnant as teenagers, abuse drugs, and be in trouble with the law. That's what they tell us. They also have a higher risk for physical or sexual abuse and are less likely to be successful as adults, especially in love and in work. In love and in work, both. They have a harder time achieving intimacy in a relationship, forming a stable marriage, or even holding a steady job. The me generation, fewer than half of adult Americans today, regard the idea of sacrifice for others as a positive moral value. That used to be something that was very much esteemed. Today it's shrugged off. The adult quest for freedom, independence, and choice in family relationships conflicts with a child's developmental needs for stability, constancy, harmony, and permanence in family life. They're just antithetical to each other. Welfare dependency also depends to be passed on from one generation to the next. None of these are really surprising when you think about it. Daughters of single parents are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers, 111% more likely to have children as teenagers, 164% more likely to have premarital birth, 92% more likely to dissolve their own marriages. Each divorce is the death of a small civilization. It inflicts wounds that never heal. And the lack of love in America is also something coming up. The love of many will grow cold, Matthew promises us. My wife has written a great deal on that. When you speak of eschatology, that's the primary verse she thinks about, is that the love of many, and that's the agape of many, by the way, of many will grow cold. The most basic form of love is found in the family. The family serves as the seedbed for virtues. If there's going to be virtues at all, that's where the roots are. So if they're not there, you got big problems. Heterosexuals reproduce, homosexuals recruit. This is the first generation in the nation's history to do worse psychologically, socially, and economically than its parents. It always used to be a step better. Not anymore. Let's take I decided, rather than lean on the Atlantic Monthly that I've done for years, I thought I'd take a look on the internet a little bit. Not a lot, a little bit. Children and divorce statistics. Half of American children will witness the breakup of a parent's marriage. Of these, close to half will also see the breakup of their parents' second marriage. That's interesting. Among the millions of children who have seen their parents divorce, 1 of every 10 will also live through 3 or more parental marriage breakups. 40% of children growing up in America today are being raised without their fathers. Of all children born to married parents this year, 50% will experience the divorce of their parents before they reach their 18th birthday. Children in repeat divorces earned lower grades, and their peers rated them as less pleasant to be around. Teenagers in single-parent families and in blended families are 3 times more likely to need psychological help within a given year. Compared to children from homes disrupted by death, children from divorced homes have more psychological problems. Think about that for a minute. They have more problems from a divorce than death in the family. Death in the family, you can reconcile to. The divorce, you never really do. The death of a parent is less devastating to a child than divorce. And I wouldn't believe this if I didn't see the statistics myself. These are shocking. What about physically damaged? Children of divorce are at greater risk to experience injury, asthma, headaches, and speech defects than children whose parents have remained married. Following divorce, children are 50% more likely to develop health problems than 2-parent families. Children living with both biological parents are 20 to 35% more physically healthy than the children from broken homes. Most victims of child molestation come from single-parent households or are the children of drug ring members. A child of a female-headed home is 10 times more likely to be beaten or murdered. Really? Wow. Did you get that, number 12? A child raised by his or her mother is 10 times more likely to be beaten or murdered. What about long-term effects here? A study of children 6 years after parental marriage breakup revealed that even after all that time, these children tended to be lonely, unhappy, anxious, and insecure. There have been books written on these topics, obviously. 70% of long-term prison inmates grew up in broken homes. That probably doesn't surprise us. What about relating to peers? Children of divorce are 4 times more likely to report problems with peers and friends than children whose parents have kept their marriages intact. That's interesting. Children of divorce, particularly boys, tend to be more aggressive toward others than those children whose parents did not divorce. Wow. Let's talk about suicide. People who come from broken homes are almost twice as likely to attempt suicide than those who do not come from broken homes. That's what the research is telling us. One last one in here. Children of divorced parents are roughly 2 times more likely to drop out of high school than their peers who benefit from living with parents who did not divorce. Okay. You know, it's interesting when we look at our national, I speak in the U.S. now, national policies contribute to family instability and breakup. Divorce itself is a public acknowledgement of failure. And problems seem to have increased since the 1960s when the Supreme Court outlawed mentioning God in schools. There was a whole series of, from 60 through 63, decisions that just shredded our cultural heritage. Hollywood celebrates divorce and unwed motherhood. They celebrate it like it's the norm. And of course, U.S. federal policy celebrates social and sexual variance. And it's getting worse and worse. You're familiar with that. Well, back to the text. I just inserted that because I think we need to realize that the problems in Corinth were pretty severe, but no more severe than the ones we have in our culture we have. I don't know how you try to relate the two. They're both pretty sick. Okay, to verse 12 then. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. To the rest speak I, not the Lord. Interesting. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. He's speaking in the mixed marriages thing, believers and non-married being married. And in the Old Testament, God forbade his people to marry Gentiles. Paul tells the Corinthians to marry only in the Lord. That's what he's suggesting. And if they're not, that's a whole other issue. If you are a child of, I love this, it's a Puritan proverb, but I couldn't resist including this. If you're a child of God and you marry a child of the devil, you're sure to have trouble with your father-in-law. I thought that's pretty cool. Marrying a Christian isn't all. Let your marriage be in the Lord. Just because he's a Christian isn't enough. Your marriage should be in the Lord. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. In the Greco-Roman world, the wife had the right to divorce her husband. But moving on here in verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. That leaves a big chance for that. The opportunity to win the partner for Christ is what he has in mind here. The word sanctified, what does that really mean? Let's understand that. It's set aside for sacred functions. The temple sanctified the gold connected with it, and the altar the gift thereon. Sanctified meant to consecrate people by baptism, like Christian marriage or atonement for sin. To reverence people, names, things, are in the place of a position of special privilege. That's what the word sanctified can mean. And there's 4 different meanings here. Or to purify someone from evil. Statistics reveal tremendous importance of a united home. I don't have to beat a dead horse. We've done with that, but that's sanctified. Now, what comes out of all this, of course, are issues. Are children saved? There are good scholars that have different views on this. Okay? But the child of a believing parent is regarded as a Christian. And why do we say that? For about 3 or 4 reasons. David's response to the loss of his son. In 2 Samuel 12, David makes it quite clear that when his son died, he expects to see him when he gets to heaven. That was David's expectation. And that's in the Word of God, so that's relevant to all of us. Perhaps a more constructive or specific instruction comes from Paul in chapter 7 of Romans. It's a very important chapter in Romans, but he makes a very strange remark in verse 9 of chapter 7. Paul says, for I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Now, as you analyze what Paul is talking about, it's a very strange remark. Because he was alive without the law. He's talking about the law. And he points there was a time when he was alive outside of the law. But when the commandment came as his way, what he's pointing to, we believe, is the age of accountability. Prior to the age of accountability, he's outside the law. But when he gets accountable, then the law applies, and he died. He's dead then. Okay, that's what he's really saying. Sin for taking occasion by the commandment deceived me and it slew me. So he's describing himself going from before the age of accountability through the age of accountability, where he then is accountable, and being accountable, he's in need of redemption. You follow me? It's kind of a complicated thing to analyze in Romans 7. But that's pretty clear what he's talking about, and that's a major stake in the ground in terms of your perspective of the status of a child. But there's something else that you should be aware of, and I'm quite intrigued with how many, especially parents of children, have never noticed this in the book of Job. When you study the book of Job, in chapter 1, you may recall that he had all these different cattle and sheep, and they're all numbered there. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, right? And as part of the trauma of Job, he lost his crops and his herds, and he lost his 7 sons and 3 daughters, right? No problem. We go through the whole thing, all the dialogues, and you go through the whole book of Job for 41 chapters. You get to chapter 42, and the good news is, in verse 10 of chapter 42, God restores to Job twice of everything he lost. So if you look through the list there of the sheep and the cattle, everything is twice as many as he lost. So God gave him twice as many sheep and twice as many cattle, and all the way through, right? And God gave him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And if you're reading carefully, you sort of say, wait a minute, he got double of everything else. How come he only got, 7 sons, not 14? He lost 7 sons and 3 daughters. And God gives him 7 sons. He doubles him up by giving him 7 and 3. and you begin to realize what the text is saying, the first 7 and 3 are waiting for him. They're waiting for him. And you would be amazed how many parents take deep comfort from that insight. I'll leave that with you to study out. Okay, but Paul continues. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. If an unbeliever decides to dismiss his wife, he, not his marriage partner, takes the full responsibility for the divorce. Wow. Okay. God has called us to peace is the commandment, and you've got all your, you can track, they're all quite consistent, obviously. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Now don't misunderstand by the way he's expressing that. Only God can save his people. But we can always hope that God will effect his plan and purpose. The willingness to live with a Christian spouse is a form of sanctification. It might lead to salvation by, it leaves that influence there that may bear fruit. That's the idea. Marriage is a vow which is not to be broken, we're reminded, right? Okay, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Paul digresses to lay down a rule 3 times. In verse 17 and 20 and 24, he lays down a rule that we would summarize by saying, you bloom where you're planted, until God makes it clear that there's a change. Your primary presumption is you bloom where you're planted. And whereas God has called everyone, so let him walk. Okay? In whatever situation a person becomes a Christian, he or she should remain there until he makes it really clear that a move is in his will. God calls the believer. And there's plenty of verses on that. You can track that down. Do a little study of your own on that. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. If any called in uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, but uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. And so, see, some of the Jewish youths tried to undo their thing to join the broader Hellenistic world. And Josephus talks a little bit about that. Most of those issues were resolved in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Distinctions disappear in Christ is the real point here. Distinctions disappear in Christ. Paul divides the universe in 3 sections: Jews, Gentiles, and the church. In the church, in Paul's mind, there's no distinction. Circumcision was of paramount importance, especially after the Maccabean struggle, a matter of life and death. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. There it is again. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Now, Paul does not address the issue of slavery. I think it's really important for us to understand that Paul, with all his zeal and commitment, was not interested in disturbing the existing structure of society. That wasn't his calling. And many pastors fail to really realize that. There are very worthwhile social issues to be dealt with. But if you do that, you're doing that instead of doing what you're called to do, which is to declare the gospel. And there's a big debate among pastors about that. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's freeman. Likewise, he that is called being free is Christ's servant. So your servanthood or freedom is in your own mind anyway. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. That's what he means in Romans when he says, owe no man anything. The slaves, they are slaves in bondage to Christ, such as the Israelites were in bondage to God. That's Paul's approach here. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. There again it is, the 3rd time. Bloom where you're planted is what he's saying. Doesn't mean that he doesn't say there isn't going to be a change, but it'll be very clear. Let God make the change. The Christian must remember that God is always with him and will never forsake him in any case. And there's plenty of scripture on that. I got Deuteronomy 31 here, Joshua 1. I didn't put in the one of the biggest ones, Romans 8. Nails it for me. Man is used in a generic sense here, Mr. and Mrs. Man, by the way. Don't play grammar with me here. Abide with God. Set your mind on heavenly things, not earthly things, is his advice all through his letters. We'll talk more about that before we're through here. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I have my judgment, as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord, to be faithful. Now concerning, so this is in regard, he's commenting in regards to the letter they wrote him. And so we can only guess what they were talking about. I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the pleasant distress, I say that is good for a man so to be. Present distress, there's a lot of scholastic speculation what on earth he might have in his mind. And present, is this a crisis, a misfortune, a famine? We're not sure. There's echoes in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. We'll see. The Greek word for distress occurs in respect to starvation in one place, that same word. It's also used when Ptolemy entered the temple of Jerusalem. It's a term of distress. Some associate with a famine in the time of Claudius. Could be. In any case, being a Christian in those days was to put one's life in jeopardy. That's his main point here. And when high seas are raging, it's no time to change ships, is the idea. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. That's his. God intended that husband and wife remain together. This can also apply to betrothal vows, in which in a Jewish context are tantamount to marriage. So there we go. He's not just minimizing that. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Paul addresses the hardships of the day for the Christian, and not the matter of sin, just that the time is trouble. Virgin to marry. So the word there is parthenos, which is mentioned 7 times in the second half of this chapter. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that they that use this world as not abusing it. For the fashion of this world passeth away. That's the basic thread here. The eternal perspective. These are poetic lines emphasizing that we should be living as if we might leave this world at any moment. We should be passing through with a light touch, is a suggestion. Earthly things should not be our ultimate objectives. We should not be absorbed by them. Okay? You may have a very nice car, but make sure the car doesn't own you. Or boat, or plane, or whatever the indulgence might be. Have something like that, fine, but make sure it doesn't have you. The time is short, is Paul's point. By the way, how many weekends do you have left? Have you ever thought about that? I was at a company, I was a board member on a company I was involved with, a guy by the name of Bernie. And I says, Bernie, how many weekends do you have left? I said, what do you mean? I guess, you're about 50. So statistically, you got about 20 years. And you got about 50 weekends a year. So you got about 1,000 weekends. You probably have about 1,000 weekends left then, huh? He looked at me startled. See, if you say 20 years, that's abstract. When you put it into weekends, it rattles when you shake it. I ran into him years later in an airport. He saw me. And, what is it now, Chuck? About 900? I didn't know what he meant at first, but it impacted him. He realized the idea of toting up the likely weekends you got left makes it a little more realistic, because we'll accept statistics typically, what our life, obviously it could happen anytime, but we have a statistical expectation, right? That's what actuarial statistics are all about. Well, if you say you've got 10 years or 20 years, that's academic. But if you say, gee, you got 500, 600 maybe weekends, ouch. That has a finite to us that may reach us, you see. So I leave that with you to think about. How many weekends do you think you've got? Take the number of years you think and multiply it by 50 to make the arithmetic simple. Yeah, okay. The world is passing away, and so is the America we once knew. Instabilities are the order of the day. Family life, desertion, divorce, and so forth. Disease, famine, and poverty cause untold misery, grief, and death. Bankruptcies of individuals and companies will be accompanied by cities, states, and countries are going bankrupt. The turmoil that's coming globally, especially in America, of all of them, America's the least prepared. It's the least prepared of all of them. And what's really disturbing when you really get into this, it's being engineered by those who have an agenda to make it so. It's not accidental. It's being designed in. So, Christ's followers are not of this world. It's interesting in John 17, Jesus does not pray for the world. He makes that point. I pray not for the world, he says. Really? I know people spend their time praying for the world. You might want to think that one through a little bit. Pray for his people, pray for the church, pray for some specifics, fine. But not the world in general. That's Satan's turf. Christ's followers are not of this world. They're laughed to scorn when they suggest chastity to prevent immorality or sin-specific diseases, or integrity of the workplace to prevent greed, or contentment with basics to prevent envy. Our citizenship is where? In heaven. In heaven. I usually, when I decorate the slide, when I do that, I have a great picture of Wall Street, you know, the street sign, and sitting on the sign are two buzzards. You're waiting for some bodies to deal with. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. And so now the without carefulness is a little misleading in our English. I would have you without care is what he really means. When he says have you without, I would have you without carefulness. What he means is under the bondage of something, under the bondage of care. And see, Paul's intention is that you be worry-free. Be worry-free. And the one I always like, a worry is a trickle of fear that soon cuts a rut so deep that it drains all other thoughts away. Isn't that descriptive? Bacon said, he that hath wife and children hath given hostages to fortune. Lightfoot said, a man who is a hero in himself becomes a coward when he thinks of his widowed wife and orphan children. Interesting. The word care for here occurs 7 times. 5 times in 1 Corinthians and twice in Philippians by Paul. I'd have you without careful. When he says carefulness, he doesn't mean don't be careful. What he really means is don't be, bound with the burden of things. Don't get yourself in a position where you've got things to care for. I think many of us who have had large homes once the kids are gone, especially whatever, there's more upkeep than it's worth the trouble. We don't have the home has us. Several of us in here I know have simplified their life and discovered how rich it can be by not being encumbered with things, But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world and how he may please his wife. See, care here is used in the positive sense. Paul tells his protege, Timothy, in his first letter to him, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Really? From Paul, that's pretty strong language. There's a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Interesting. There are all kinds of textual problems with this verse, by the way. But anyway, an unmarried woman is able to give herself fully to the work of the Lord, is the thought that's behind all that. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. The word snare there is like putting a noose on you. The word only occurs here in the New Testament, the particular word there. It's like a leash. In other words, he's saying, I don't want to put a leash on you, is what he's really saying. A snare sounds like a trap. No, well, it's like a leash. I speak for your profit, not that I may cast a snare or a leash on you, but for that which is comely, that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. See, anything that distracts you from the Lord is really a form of sin. If any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely towards his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and the need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. But if any man, and there's a lack of clarity of expression here, is it the father, the guardians, the fiancés, or customs? You can take your pick. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, he doeth well. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. So he praises marriage and exalts celibacy as a special calling, not for everyone, in other words. This passage is a likely response to specific cases that were inquired of in the previous letter. People overlook that. He's not necessarily speaking for general rules here. He's responding to a specific letter that we don't possess. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. But in 1 Timothy 5, he urges young widows to be married again. Some will choose not to in Luke 2, and you can chase those down if you like. But I want to shift in another perspective, since we've jumped into the topic of marriage, and we could spend a whole weekend on that subject, and we have, by the way. Those materials are available. But I'd like to talk about the mystical basis of marriage. What on earth am I talking about? There's the biological basis of marriage, obviously for procreation and so forth. There's a psychological basis of marriage, a union to meet life's challenges, joys, and sorrows. We can relate to that. There's a sociological basis for marriage. The family unit is the primary element of the tribe, the community, the nation, right? But those are the commonly discussed ones. There is a fourth one that's overlooked. And that's the mystical basis, the supernatural and spiritual basis. God's ordained unit through which he communicates his most significant truths. It's interesting that the marriage relationship is what God uses to communicate the relationship between Yehovah and Israel and Christ and his church. Those relationships are intimate, and God uses the marriage in both cases to communicate that kind of intimacy. So let's take a look at that for a minute. Preeminence, Christ is the head of the church. There's all kinds of, I encourage you to run through those and get that perspective. Clearly, the head of the church is Christ himself. The preciousness of his people is paramount here. They're called the apple of his eye in Deuteronomy 32, the crown of his glory in Isaiah 62, the stones of the crown, and also an ensign in Zechariah 9. And they're referred to as jewels. His love for the church is hammered in the 5th chapter of Ephesians. And a handful of other places too. The church is also referred to as his bride. And there's a lot of debate, and I'm not going to get into that here, but is the body of Christ synonymous with the bride of Christ? I don't think it is, by the way. But there's subtlety difference is what's there. But the marriage is also a prophetic type. The Akedah, Abraham and Isaac, 22. Isaac is edited out of the record from the time he was offered until Isaac and Rebekah meet each other at the well of Lahai Roi. It's interesting that Isaac is edited out of the record from the time he's offered till the time he's united with his bride. I think that's provocative. The Holy Spirit actually diddled with the text there. We get our notes on Genesis 22 for that. Ruth and Boaz. interesting mechanism that God uses to explain us what a kinsman redeemer is. Boaz, of course, is the kinsman redeemer, the Goel. Ruth is the Gentile bride. Naomi is how the land gets out of the redemption. The land Naomi gets her land back. But the whole modeling of the book of Ruth, little 4-chapter book, little romantic book, really is an essential prerequisite to really understand what's going on in Revelation chapter 5. And Jehovah and Israel, the whole book of Hosea hammers this, the relationship of Yehovah and Israel. But here's one that may surprise you. Cana, the third day, Tuesday, the double blessing. And God, there's messages there. But the other one that may surprise you is Adam. We all know the story of Adam, but have you ever looked at Adam as a type, as a mystical foreshadowing of Christ? Because we have Christ called the last Adam. Well, what's the first Adam all about? And it's a very interesting thing. Adam as a type of Christ, that's a strange thought, isn't it? See, we know from 1 Timothy 2, Paul emphasized that Adam was not deceived. Eve obviously was deceived. We all know the story. But the point that Paul makes is that Adam was not deceived. She may have been deceived. He wasn't. He knew what he was doing. Really? Adam loved Eve so much. You know, if it was you and me, we're there, and we're still clothed with light. We come home, and Eve, oh, kid, you're in trouble. You took the fruit? I'll pray for you. I mean, that's terrible. I really feel sorry. No, that's not what he did. Adam loved Eve so much that he knowingly chose to share her destiny, whatever it is. You've got to be kidding. Think that through. He knew, he wasn't deceived. He knew what he was doing. He was joining her in her predicament. Wow. Wow. Without which, by the way, there would have been no Redeemer. There would have been no seed of the woman. But God had a plan for sinners, and Adam chose to join her in that predicament. Can you imagine how much he loved Eve? And of course, the question is, do you love your wife that much? I won't ask a ray of hands. Tough stuff, huh? Wow. Now, it's interesting, as you go through your Bible, you discover something interesting. There's a number of cases where there's Gentile brides in the narrative. All right? Adam and Eve is an example. But Isaac and Rebekah. Okay? Joseph and Asenath. Moses and Zipporah. These are all Gentile brides, technically. Salmon and Rahab. Yeah, Rahab, the prostitute, was married to Solomon. And of course, she is the mother of Boaz, right? And Boaz takes a Moabitess. So we've got Eve, Rebekah, Asenath, Zipporah, Rahab, and Ruth. Those are the Gentile brides in the Bible. That interesting? Notice something. These Gentile brides have no death recorded. Now, they obviously died, don't misunderstand me. But I'm using a rabbinical argument that we used about Melchizedek. There's no death recorded. So in type, you see, they're not killed. Now, how many of them are there? There's 7. Which one's the 7th? The church is the Gentile bride of the Redeemer. Has no death recorded. I just throw that out for what it's worth. It's included in the price of admission. We have a marriage proposal that was written in blood on a wooden cross, erected in Judea some 2,000 years. It's a love letter. And that's what it's all about. The entire universe will be measured by that love letter. In the ancient Jewish measure, of course, you had the Shidduchin, the engagement, which was arranged by the father. Then you had the agreement, the ketubah, where the bridegroom was absent to build a house, and that's what he's doing now. I go to prepare a place for you. The bride is snatched in the middle of the night for the marriage, and then they celebrate the marriage in a ceremony, the huppah, which is a 7-day celebration. And I encourage you to notice the difference between the marriage and the marriage supper. The marriage is in the Father's house. The supper is on the earth when the kingdom is set up. Thank Arnold Fruchtenbaum for pointing that out. So there we are. We could obviously spend a lot of time on, this is rich material, but I've tried to put all the roots in your notes that you can take them down. The ones that you're drawn to, you can go ahead and do your own study. But with that, let's bow with a word of prayer.